Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story, Whispers of the Bare Moon. The world of Isabelle Rowe was one of muted colours and muffled sounds, a place of suffocating politeness. Her father, Judge Rowe, presided over their manicured estate with the same cold, unassailable logic he applied to his courtroom. It was a world of clipped hedges, of cold marble that seemed to leach the warmth from one's skin, and of whispered judgments that hung in the air like dust motes in the autumn light. Today, at an outdoor luncheon that felt more like a tribunal than a celebration, Isabelle was the prize exhibit. Dressed in a gown the colour of a pale sky, she was a perfect porcelain doll, placed just so, her discomfort a fine invisible crack in her composure. Her father was holding forth, his voice a smooth, confident baritone discussing his recent legal victory over the local tribe's land claims. He spoke of progress, of economic necessity, of the unimpeachable power of the law he represented. He dismissed the tribe's centuries of history with the wave of a hand, as one might dismiss a fly. "Sentimental nonsense," he declared to the nodding heads around the table. "You cannot halt the march of progress for the sake of a few old superstitions." Isabelle felt a familiar nausea rise in her throat. She picked at the lace on her sleeve, the threads catching on her manicured nails. His world was a cage, and its bars were forged from his certainty. Later, seeking a moment's respite, she slipped away from the drone of conversation and walked toward the edge of the property, where the judge's immaculate lawn gave way to the unruly chaos of the forest. The air here was different, carrying on it a scent she couldn't name, something wild and mournful. A few steps further, and the scent became acrid, the sharp tang of smoke and grief. She saw it then, the edge of the burnt lands, a scar of black and grey against the vibrant golds and reds of the late autumn woods. It was the land her father's victory had condemned. She was so absorbed in the desolate beauty of the scene that she didn't hear him approach. One moment she was alone, the next a hand was over her mouth, and a hard, warm body was pressed against her back. A scream died in her throat, smothered by a calloused palm that smelled of earth and ash. She struggled, her heels digging uselessly into the soft turf, but it was like fighting against a mountain. The arm around her waist was unyielding, yet it held her with a surprising firm gentleness. There was no brutality in the touch, only an inexorable strength. He moved with a silence that was terrifying, his feet making no sound on the forest floor. He was a shadow, a phantom of the woods she had been taught to fear. He carried her deeper into the smouldering forest, away from the manicured lawns and the sound of her father's voice. The devastation was immense, a cathedral of ancient trees reduced to blackened skeletons. The ground was a carpet of grey ash that puffed up around his moccasined feet. The sharp, clean scent of her lavender perfume felt like a violation here, a shrill note in a symphony of sorrow. He finally set her down in a small unburnt clearing, though he did not release her arm. He was tall, with hair as black as a raven's wing, and eyes that held the deep, quiet wisdom of the forest itself. His face was stark, carved from granite and sorrow, and his clothes were simple deerskin, stained with soot. He did not look at her like a prisoner, but like a burden he had been forced to carry. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his gaze missing nothing. "I am Ahyoka." His voice was low and resonant, like the thrum of a distant drum. He finally released her arm, and she instinctively clutched the cold, smooth silver of the locket at her neck, its weight a familiar anchor in this terrifying new world. Inside was a miniature of her father's face, smiling and sure. "My father's counsel," Ahyoka began, his voice devoid of emotion. decreed that the judge's daughter should be taken, that your life should be given in payment for this." He gestured to the charred remains of the forest around them. "They sent me to kill you." Isabelle's blood ran cold. She could feel the frantic thud of her own heart against her ribs. But he had not killed her. He had brought her here, to the heart of his people's pain. "I disobeyed," he said simply. He looked away from her, toward the ruin of a great oak, its branches like skeletal arms raised in supplication. "My father is Howling Wolf. He believes in a law of blood for blood. I follow a different law, one that whispers from the earth itself. It told me to find you." "Then let me go," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. "Please." Ahyoka turned his gaze back to her, and for the first time she saw something other than sorrow in his eyes. It was a profound, weary conflict. "You cannot go back. To my people you are a ghost, an emblem of their pain. Your father's world sees you as a victim to be avenged, and my father's world sees you as a debt to be paid. There is no place for you now." "What do you mean?" she cried, panic rising like a tide within her. He stepped closer, and his presence was overwhelming, elemental. "I have disobeyed my father. I have brought you here, into the heart of the wound. The council will not harbour you. They will see your white skin and hear your father's words in every breath you take." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face as if seeking something he wasn't sure he would find. "There is only one path I can see, one way to grant you sanctuary." She waited, her breath held tight in her chest. "You must agree to be presented as my spirit-bonded bride," he said, the words falling like stones into the silence. "A woman brought to me by a vision. The lie must be so strong it becomes a truth. Only a sacred designation, a bond blessed by the spirits, will protect you from my father's law." Isabelle stared at him, aghast. It was madness, a lie upon a lie. And yet, looking into his steady, solemn gaze, she saw no other choice. She was trapped between two worlds, and this strange, silent man was offering her the only bridge. She thought of his hands stained with soot and earth, yet holding her with a strange reverence as if she were not a captive, but a prophecy he was reluctant to fulfill. She gave a single shaky nod. The first whisper of the bare moon had been spoken, and her old world had already turned to ash. Ahyoka's dwelling was not a cage, but a sanctuary. Built into the side of a hill overlooking a misty valley, the cabin was simple and sturdy, crafted from the forest itself. It was a world away from the cold marble and suffocating damask of her father's house. Here the air was warm and smelled of cedar, of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, of beeswax from the candles that cast a soft golden glow on the rough-hewn walls. The tone of their days was one of quiet observation, of a slowly thawing fear. The lie began the moment they arrived. He presented her to the few hunters and trappers they'd encountered on the paths near his home. He spoke in his native tongue, a language of soft consonants and flowing vowels, and though she could not understand the words, she understood their weight. He spoke of her with a solemn gravity that made the falsehood feel true. She felt the eyes of his people on her, saw their suspicion in the tightness of their mouths, but she also saw their deference to him, to the shamanic blood that ran in his veins. She was the spirit bride, a creature of vision, and so she was treated with a cautious, fearful respect. He began to teach her, not with lectures and books, but with his hands and his silence. He taught her the new language of this world, a language spoken by the wind in the pines and the cry of the hawk. He showed her how to find north by the moss on the trees, how to listen to the chatter of the birds for warnings of an approaching storm or a predator. When she sliced her hand open while clumsily trying to chop vegetables, he said nothing of her foolishness. Instead, he led her into the woods, his long fingers gently guiding her to a patch of feathery green leaves. yarrow. He crushed them into a poultice, his touch on her skin impersonal yet deeply, shockingly intimate, and bound the wound with a strip of clean linen. The sting of the cut was nothing compared to the jolt that shot through her at the brief, practiced touch of his fingers against hers. They lived in a shared solitude, two ghosts haunting the edge of a broken world. The nights were the hardest. The silence of the valley was immense, broken only by the hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a wolf. In those long hours, Isabelle would lie awake, wrapped in a rough wool blanket that smelled of him, of wood smoke and pine, and listen to the steady rhythm of his breathing from across the small room. She would think of her father, of the life that had been stolen from her, and a wave of grief and rage would wash over her. But then she would think of Ahyoka, of the quiet dignity with which he moved, the gentle patience of his teachings, and a different, more confusing emotion would take its place. One night, as they sat by the fire, the flames dancing in his dark eyes, she found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. "Why are you in exile?" He was silent for a long time, feeding sticks into the fire. The only sound was the crackle and hiss of the burning wood. "When I was a boy," he said at last, his voice a low murmur, "I had a vision. I saw the Great Bear Spirit, the mother of our people, weeping as the forest burned. I told my father, and he saw it as a sign of weakness. He said a warrior's spirit should be filled with rage at the fire, not sorrow. He said my heart was too soft, that I felt the pain of the earth too deeply to be a leader of men." He poked at the embers with a stick, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "He has not looked at me the same since. I was marked as different. It is better that I live on the periphery." In his words, Isabelle heard an echo of her own life. She too had been marked as different, her own quiet, introspective nature a disappointment to her powerful, pragmatic father. "I had been taught to fear the wild, to see it as a thing to be conquered," she found herself saying, the words tumbling out of her before she could stop them. "But living with you, I began to understand it was not wildness I had feared, but freedom." He looked up at her then, and the space between them crackled with a sudden intense connection. He saw her, truly saw her, not as the judge's daughter, not as a spirit bride, but as another soul living on the periphery. Her perception of him shifted, subtly at first, then all at once. She began to see past her fear, past the strangeness of her situation. She watched the way he moved, with an economy of motion that was both powerful and graceful, like a panther. She listened to the cadence of his voice when he spoke the names of the plants and the stars, a soft poetry that made her own language feel harsh and clumsy. She ate the rabbit stew he cooked over the fire, smoky and rich, and felt a nourishment that went deeper than her bones. One evening he pointed to the full silver orb rising over the valley. "The bare moon," he said. It was under the light of that same moon that he had taken her, and under its light that she was being reborn. The ruse of being his bride began to feel less like a performance and more like a strange, unsettling truth taking root in her soul. She would catch him looking at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before he would turn away. The rough texture of the wool blanket he had given her, the intricate patterns of the beadwork on his moccasins, the steady, quiet presence of him in the small cabin, these were the anchors of her new reality. In her old home, she had 1,000 books that spoke of truth, but none of them had taught her the name of a single flower, or the feel of the earth breathing beneath her feet. The summons came on a morning when the air was sharp with the promise of winter. A young boy from the village, his face a mask of solemn duty, arrived with a message for Ahyoka. He was to present himself before his father, Howling Wolf, and the Council of Elders. Ahyoka's jaw tightened as he listened to the boy's message, his eyes dark with a familiar, weary pain. He was reluctant to leave Isabelle, his gaze lingering on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice low. "Do not leave the cabin. You will be safe here." But as she watched him disappear down the winding path, his broad back straight and proud, a new and unfamiliar emotion took root in her heart. It was not fear for herself, but for him. She had been a passive creature her entire life, a doll to be arranged and admired. But something had shifted within her in this small, quiet cabin. She was no longer just the judge's daughter. She was Ahyoka's spirit bride, and the lie had become her shield, her identity. And now, the man who'd given her that shield was walking into the heart of the danger that she had brought upon him. Driven by a mixture of dread and a fierce, nascent protectiveness, she disobeyed him. She wrapped herself in a dark cloak and followed him at a distance, her city-bred clumsiness making her feel like a charging bull in his silent world. She moved from tree to tree, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs until she reached the edge of the tribal village. It was a collection of modest wooden structures, nestled in a deep, protected cove of the forest. The air here was different from the peaceful solitude of Ahyoka's valley. It was tense, heavy with unspoken grief and suspicion. The smoke from a central council fire hung thick and acrid in the air, casting long, wavering shadows that felt accusatory. It was a scene of Bronte-esque Gothic tension, a place of secrets and simmering resentments. Isabelle hid in the shadows at the edge of the council circle, her face pale, her breath held tight in her chest. She saw Ahyoka standing before a group of older men, his face impassive. At their centre sat an older man with a face like a weathered stone, his eyes burning with a cold, unyielding fire. This, she knew, was Howling Wolf. He spoke in his native tongue, his voice a harsh, guttural torrent of rage. The words were alien to her, but their meaning was brutally clear. He did not believe in the spirit bride. He saw her as a white devil, a poison brought into their midst. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at his son. "You bring this ghost into our sacred places and call it destiny. I call it treason. Her skin is the colour of the ash that covers our hunting grounds." Isabelle flinched as if struck. The venom in his voice was a physical thing, a poison that seeped into her very bones. She saw the faces of the other elders, saw the doubt and suspicion warring with their respect for Ahyoka's spiritual authority. Ahyoka stood his ground. He did not raise his voice. He met his father's fury with a quiet, unshakable dignity. His own words a calm, steady river against the storm of his father's rage. He spoke of his vision, of the whispers of the earth, of a law that was older and deeper than the law of vengeance. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The wound was too raw, the grief too fresh. How could they trust a vision that brought the daughter of their enemy into their heart? The council ended with no resolution, the tension hanging in the air like an unsheathed blade. Ahyoka turned and walked away, his jaw tight with a pain that was more than just the sting of his father's words. It was the pain of a man torn between his people and his soul. He found her on the path back to the cabin. She had not meant for him to see her, but she had been unable to move, frozen by the terrible scene she had just witnessed. He stopped, his dark eyes meeting hers, and the fragile peace that had grown between them in the quiet solitude of the cabin was shattered. The weight of the real world, of his father's hatred and her father's sins, came crashing down upon them. "You followed me," he said, his voice flat. "I was afraid for you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your fear does not help." The words were harsh, clipped. "Your presence here, it is a fire that will consume us both." In that moment, hearing the venom in his father's voice, she was no longer a judge's daughter. She was the weapon being used against the only man who had shown her mercy. My safety was his ruin. The cold dread that had been coiling in her stomach now felt like a block of ice. The lie that had been their shield was now the very thing that would destroy them. He did not speak another word. He simply grabbed her hand, his grip hard and urgent, and pulled her off the path. He moved with a desperate primal urgency, not back toward the fragile safety of the cabin, but deeper into the wild, into the heart of the ancient forest. The world became a blur of green and brown, the slap of branches against her face, the burn of her lungs as she struggled to keep up with his long, silent strides. They finally stopped before a thundering curtain of water, a powerful waterfall that crashed into a deep crystalline pool below. The roar was deafening, a raw elemental sound that drowned out the world. The last light of the day was fading, but the full silver disk of the bare moon was rising, its light casting an ethereal glow on the mist that rose from the falls. Without a word, he pulled her forward, through the cold, shocking curtain of water and into the secret space that lay behind it. They were in a grotto, a hidden, sacred place. The air was cool and damp, smelling of wet stone and ancient earth. Shafts of moonlight pierced the darkness, illuminating the small cavern in a painterly chiaroscuro of silver and shadow. They stood there, shivering and soaked, the roar of the waterfall creating a world out of time, a sanctuary from the hatred and fear that lay just beyond the veil of water. And then the tension that had been stretched taut between them finally snapped. "My vision," he began, his voice raw, ragged, barely audible above the thunder of the falls. The weeping bear was not my only one. He turned to face her, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity in the dim light. Water dripped from his black hair, tracing the hard lines of his face. "For years I have dreamt of you. A woman with a pale face and eyes the colour of a winter sky. I heard your voice in my dreams, though I did not understand the words. I saw your fear, your loneliness." He took a step closer, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs gently brushing the wet skin of her cheeks. "I did not save you out of mercy alone, Isabelle. I saved you because my spirit has always known you. I saved you because you were the other half of my own soul." The confession hung in the air between them, more powerful, more binding than any lie they had ever told. The walls between them, captor and captive, his world and hers, the lie they had built and the truth he had just revealed, crumbled into dust. In that moment she understood. The ruse had to become real. Not for the council, not for his father, but for them. It was the only way. He kissed her then, and it was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision, a desperate, hungry release of all the fear and longing that had coiled in the silence between them. His mouth was hard and demanding on hers, and she met his hunger without hesitation, a wildness she hadn't known she possessed surging through her veins. Her hands tangled in his wet hair, pulling him closer as a low sound, half sob, half moan, tore from her throat. The world narrowed to the thunder of the waterfall and the frantic beat of their hearts. His hands, usually so careful and restrained, were now instruments of exquisite discovery. He didn't rip her wet clothes away. The act was far more deliberate, a slow, sacred unveiling that was its own form of torment. His fingers worked the buttons of her tunic, each touch a spark against her cold, damp skin. The rough wool peeled away, exposing the pale skin of her shoulders and throat to the cool, misty air of the grotto. The contrast made her shiver, a violent tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. The moonlight filtered through the curtain of water, painted the lines of her body in strokes of silver and shadow. Her fear had burned away, leaving in its place a profound, aching need that pooled hot and heavy deep inside her. This was a different kind of surrender, not of a captive, but of a soul to its missing half. "Isabelle," he whispered, his voice a raw prayer against her skin, and then his hands began their worship. He traced the delicate line of her collarbone with one calloused finger, and a jolt of pure sensation shot through her, so intense it made her gasp. She felt utterly exposed, utterly seen, as his hands learned every curve, every secret hollow of her body. They slid down her ribs, exploring the gentle flare of her hips, the soft plane of her stomach. She felt her muscles quiver and contract under his touch. No one had ever touched her like this, with such reverent hunger, as if he were memorizing her with his fingertips. A whimper escaped her lips. Her own hands, clumsy with a desperate need, worked at the ties of his clothes until they fell away. He was beautiful, a creature of earth and moonlight, his skin gleaming with the mist of the falls. He laid her back against the cold, smooth stone of the grotto wall. The shock of the cold was a stark, electrifying contrast to the fire of his skin against hers. His mouth replaced his hands, tasting the salt and river water from her skin. He kissed the hollow of her throat, the frantic pulse he found there, then moved lower, his lips tracing a hot path over her skin that made her arch her back in a silent plea. Isabelle's head fell back against the stone, her eyes fluttering closed as she gave herself over to the symphony of sensation. He rose over her, and she felt the heat of his body, the promise of a deeper connection. He paused, his dark eyes boring into hers, a silent question passing between them. She answered by reaching for him, pulling him down, a silent yes that echoed in the roaring chamber. When their bodies finally joined, it was a slow, deep union and that stole her breath and filled a void she never knew she had. It was a claiming, a deliberate, sacred act that sealed their fates together. For a moment, he remained still, letting her body adjust to the glorious, overwhelming closeness of him. Then he began to move. It was a primal, powerful rhythm, a dance of shadow and light in the secret heart of the world. Her own soft, breathless moans merged with the thunder of the water. The feeling of the cold stone against her back grounded her as he took her higher, their movements becoming more urgent. He was not just touching her body, he was touching her soul, and she was giving it freely, joyfully. The pleasure built within her, a searing, unbearable heat that coiled tighter and tighter until she thought she would shatter. The climax was a shared, shuddering wave, a violent, beautiful tearing away of the veil. A hoarse cry was torn from his throat, and her own release was a blinding flash of white light behind her eyes as she called his name into the roaring darkness. In the echoing silence that followed, broken only by the eternal pulse of the waterfall, they clung to each other, their bodies still trembling from the force of their connection. He collapsed against her, his forehead resting on hers, their breath mingling in the cool misty air. Two souls, once broken and lost, now forged into one in the heart of the bare moon's secret sanctuary. Dawn broke over the forest, the light soft and forgiving, the mist rising from the damp earth like the ghosts of the night's passions. Word had travelled, carried on the wind, or by unseen messengers. Her father had come. They met in a neutral clearing at the edge of the forest, a place that belonged to neither world. Judge Rowe was flanked by a small party of armed men, his face a mask of grim determination. Opposite them stood Howling Wolf and the tribal elders, their faces equally hard and unyielding. It was a standoff, a silent war of wills between two worlds that had only ever known conflict. But then a new figure stepped into the space between them. It was Isabelle, with Ahyoka at her side, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. She was no longer the fragile porcelain doll who had been taken from the edge of the manicured lawn. She stood tall and straight, her fine silk gown replaced by practical deerskin leggings and a simple tunic. Her hair was no longer in an elaborate coiffure, but in a single thick braid, woven with a single hawk's feather that Ahyoka had given her. She looked at her father, her heart aching with a love that was now tempered by a new, unshakable strength. "Father," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with an authority he had never heard from her before. "I was not harmed. I was saved." She became the bridge. She turned to Howling Wolf and spoke, not in his tongue, but in the language of her heart, a language of respect and understanding. She spoke of her own captivity in her father's world, of the freedom she'd found in the heart of the forest. And then she began to translate, her voice the calm, steady link between the two proud, stubborn men. She translated her father's fear into a language of parental love, and she translated Howling Wolf's grief into a language of a people's pain. Finally, she turned back to her father. "I am not coming home," she said, the words both a declaration and a plea. "Because I am home." She took Ahyoka's hand in hers, their fingers lacing together in a gesture of simple, profound unity. "My place is here, with him." Judge Rowe looked at his daughter, truly looked at her for the first time, not as an extension of his own ambition, but as a woman. He saw the strength in her eyes, the set of her jaw, the way she stood, no longer bowed by the weight of his expectations. He saw the fierce, protective love in Ahyoka's eyes as he looked at her, and in that moment, the judge's cold, logical world cracked. He could not fight this. He could not win this, because this was not a battle to be won, but a truth to be accepted. He gave a single sharp nod, a gesture of relinquishment. He was not giving his daughter to a captor, but to a life she had freely chosen. Before he left, he ordered his men to leave a crate of supplies, blankets, salted meat, medicine, a silent, grudging gesture of peace. Isabelle and Ahyoka walked back to their cabin hand in hand, the world quiet and still around them. The threat had passed. The war was over. As they entered the small warm space, Isabelle walked to a small wooden chest where she had kept her few remaining possessions from her old life. She took the silver locket from around her neck, its cold weight so familiar against her skin. She opened it one last time, looked at the smiling, confident face of her father, and then she closed it, the click of the clasp a final, definitive sound. She placed the locket in the box and closed the lid. It was her final act of liberation. That night, they lay together before their fire, its warm golden light flickering on their skin. A profound and knowing tenderness settled between them, a quiet language spoken not with words, but with the soft sounds of breath and the gentle crackle of the hearth. This was the peaceful certainty that follows a storm, a deep and settled calm. He kissed her with a slow, lingering reverence, each touch of his lips a silent promise. His hands moved over her to soothe and reassure, learning the new landscape of her body, which was now irrevocably his. Their closeness was a silent vow, the slow, deliberate building of a life in the small, sacred space of their home. It was firelight and whispered truths, the profound, unshakable intimacy of a shared future. He held her, his arm a comfortable, familiar weight around her, his heartbeat a steady rhythm against her back. And as she drifted off to sleep, safe in the arms of the man who had been her captor, her saviour, her destiny, she finally understood. A home was not four walls, but the space carved out in another soul. In the heart of the wild, surrounded by the whispers of the bare moon, she had not been captured, but finally, irrevocably set free. The Duchess of Great Jones Street. The heat in Mrs. Astor's ballroom on Great Jones Street was a physical presence. A thick, suffocating blanket woven from the scent of wilting magnolias, expensive French perfume, and the collective anxious breath of New York's striving elite. It clung to the damask curtains and rosewood furniture, settled in the folds of silk gowns, and beaded on the brows of men whose starched collars had begun to lose their resolve. Julian Ashcroft, however, remained impeccable. He stood near a marble column, a glass of champagne untouched in his hand, his posture a study in calculated ease. Inside, his mind was a whirlwind of strategic calculation. He was a southerner, a man from Savannah, with a past he kept carefully folded away, armed with little more than a sharp legal mind and a hunger so immense it felt like a hollow ache in his chest. He had come to this city of industry and inherited wealth to conquer it, to carve his name into its stony heart until the whispers of his modest origins were silenced by the roar of his success. Tonight was a battlefield, and every smile, every nod, every carefully chosen word was a move in a campaign he could not afford to lose. He watched the dancers spin under the gaslight chandeliers, a dizzying carousel of jewels and ambition. The rhythm of the waltz was the seductive heartbeat of this world, a world he both coveted and despised. It was a gilded cage, and he was determined to become one of its keepers. Then she appeared, and the rhythm of the room seemed to falter. Eleanor Pembroke. They called her the Duchess of Great Jones Street, a title bestowed with a mixture of admiration and mockery. She was not a confection of lace and simpering smiles. Her gown of deep sapphire silk was elegant but severe, her dark hair coiled in a simple regal knot at the nape of her neck. It was her posture that arrested him, the straightness of her spine, the directness of her gaze. She did not drift through the crowd, she navigated it. As she passed a knot of gossiping matrons, Julian heard one of them, Mrs. van der Luyden, make a cloying comment about the new railway bonds. Eleanor's response, clear and cool, cut through the humid air. "Indeed, Mrs. van der Luyden. It seems we are now measuring progress by how swiftly we can flee the city we pretend to adore." The matrons blinked, their fans fluttering in confused agitation. Julian felt a smile touch his lips, a genuine one, for the first time that evening. It was a sentiment he had harboured himself, a shard of truth in a mountain of glittering artifice. He felt an immediate magnetic pull, a curiosity that transcended strategy. She moved through this gilded cage as if she owned it, yet her eyes held the weary wisdom of a prisoner, he thought. I came to conquer this world, but in her I see a world I'd rather explore. Emboldened by a reckless impulse that momentarily overrode his caution, he moved toward her. She was examining a painting, a rather sentimental landscape of the Hudson River. Her expression was one of polite indifference. A rather tame depiction of a wild river, wouldn't you agree, Miss Pembroke? He said, his voice a low counterpoint to the music. She turned, and her eyes, the colour of a stormy sea, met his. There was no surprise in them, only assessment. "Mr. Ashcroft, I am surprised to find a man of law so interested in the aesthetics of landscape." "A lawyer must understand the nature of things, Miss Pembroke, both wild and tame." He gave her a slight bow. "The waltz is beginning. May I have the honour?" She hesitated for a beat, her gaze sweeping over him, taking in the perfect cut of his coat, the ambition burning like a low fever in his eyes. He expected a polite refusal. Instead, a flicker of something, challenge perhaps, sparked in her expression. "Very well, Mr. Ashcroft, but I must warn you, I prefer a partner who can lead without stumbling." He led her to the floor, his hand resting on the small of her back, the silk of her gown warm beneath his palm. They moved together with a surprising fluidity, two sets of calculations aligning in perfect time. The dance was a conversation in itself, a physical volley of wit and will. "You are new to our city's particular brand of enthusiasm," she said, her voice a murmur against the swell of the orchestra. "I am a student of it," he replied, guiding her through a turn. "I find it endlessly fascinating." "Do you? Or do you simply find it useful?" The question was a sharp, delicate probe. He was accustomed to the fawning flattery of young women hoping for a proposal, not this intellectual dissection. Usefulness is a form of fascination, he countered, just as beauty can be a form of power. Her eyes flashed. You speak of ambition, Mr. Ashcroft, but is it your own? Or is it a tune composed by the men who own these houses? He was so taken aback by her perception that he almost did stumble. She saw him, not the polished facade, but the machinery working beneath it. The scent of crushed gardenias on her wrist filled his senses, a heady, intoxicating fragrance that seemed both wild and refined, much like the woman herself. The waltz ended, leaving them breathless and flush with a tension that was more than just physical exertion. The heat of the room felt more oppressive than ever. I find myself in need of air, Eleanor said, her fan moving in a sharp, impatient rhythm. Allow me, Julian said, and without waiting for a response, he guided her through a set of French doors to a secluded balcony. The cool night air was a relief, a sudden baptism after the suffocating heat of the ballroom. Below them, a walled garden lay in shadow, the scent of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine rising to meet them. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the distant music a muted thrum. Here, away from the prying eyes and the gilded pretense, their masks began to slip. You despise it, don't you? He said, his voice quiet. This performance. She turned to face him, leaning back against the stone balustrade. The moonlight softened the severity of her features, revealing a vulnerability she kept carefully guarded. I despise the cage, she corrected. The bars are gold, the food is plentiful, but the view never changes. She looked at him, her gaze unnervingly direct. And you, Mr. Ashcroft, what do you truly desire, beyond the approval of men who measure a man's worth by the vintage of his port? The question disarmed him. No one had ever asked him that. No one had cared to look past the ambition to the man beneath. I desire a life of substance, he admitted, the words feeling foreign and yet profoundly true on his tongue. To build something that lasts, to not be forgotten. She nodded slowly, a sad sort of understanding in her eyes. A legacy, I understand. My legacy is to be a prize, a beautiful object to be acquired and displayed. I would rather be the architect. In that moment, under the vast star-dusted sky, Julian felt a connection so profound it startled him. He saw past the Duchess, past the debutante, to the brilliant, yearning soul trapped within. He saw a partner, a mind that could challenge his own, a spirit that could match his fire. The conquest of New York society suddenly seemed a hollow, tawdry prize compared to the world he glimpsed in her eyes. The game had changed. He no longer wanted to win this world, he wanted to win her. Their courtship could not flourish in the stifling hothouse of Great Jones Street. Society had its rules, its rigid choreographies of calls and chaperone carriage rides, all conducted under the scrutinizing gaze of 1,000 eyes. A relationship born on a balcony in a moment of shared rebellion required a different soil in which to grow, and so they began to meet in secret. Their world became the quiet, forgotten corners of the city. They found a dusty, sun-drenched bookshop on a cobbled side street, a place that smelled of old paper, leather, and decaying glue. The proprietor, a stooped man with ink-stained fingers, paid them no mind. Accustomed to lovers of all sorts seeking refuge amongst his silent, towering shelves. Here, surrounded by the thoughts of dead poets and radical philosophers, Eleanor was transformed. She was no longer the icy Duchess, but a woman alive with intellectual fervour. She would pull a volume from a high shelf, her eyes alight, and read a passage aloud, her voice a low, passionate hum that made the hairs on Julian's arm stand on end. He found himself drawn into her world, a world of ideas and treated debate that felt more real, more vital, than any of the stilted conversations he endured in the drawing rooms of his patrons. He in turn began to shed his own armour. He spoke to her not of his legal triumphs, but of his fears. He confessed the weight of his family's expectations in Savannah, the genteel poverty he had fled, the gnawing, deep-seated fear of insignificance that drove him with a relentless whip. One cool, misty morning, they met at dawn in a public park. The city was still asleep, the air tasting of damp earth and the coming day. They bought sweet red strawberries from a street vendor, their fingers brushing as he passed her the paper cone. The simple intimacy of the act, the taste of the fruit on his tongue, was more potent than any carefully orchestrated social ritual. He fears being unseen, Eleanor thought, watching him as he stared out over the fog-shrouded pond. It is the same fear I have, only mine is of being seen for the wrong reasons. Perhaps we are two sides of the same tarnished coin. That afternoon Julian found himself drawn back to the bookshop alone. He purchased a slim, controversial volume of poetry by a new radical author, a book no respectable woman would be permitted to own. It was a declaration, a signal that he saw her, the real her, the architect trapped inside the prize. He brought it to her that evening, using the pretext of returning a misplaced glove to gain entrance to her family's grand, silent house. He found her in her private sitting room, a space that defied the Pembroke family's opulent aesthetic. It was a room of books, not embroidery hoops. Volumes were stacked on every available surface, their spines cracked, their pages filled with her own spidery annotations. It was her sanctuary, her rebellion. He presented the book to her. She took it, her breath catching as she read the title. Her eyes lifted to his, wide and luminous in the soft lamplight. "How did you know?" she whispered. "Because I have been listening," he said softly. Their hands touched over the cover, a current of understanding passing between them, a silent acknowledgement of their deepening bond. He could feel the fine tremor in her fingers. The air in the room grew thick, charged with unspoken words, with the potent, terrifying intimacy of being truly seen. "With you," he confessed, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. "The air is clearer. I feel I can finally breathe." She looked from the book to his face, her expression a mixture of awe and trepidation. He saw the walls she had so carefully constructed begin to crumble, and in their place a raw, aching vulnerability. He closed the small distance between them, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. Her skin was like cool silk. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of demanding passion, not the kiss of a suitor claiming his prize. It was a kiss of profound recognition, of reverence. It was slow and gentle, a question and an answer in one. Her lips, at first hesitant, softened under his, parting with a sigh that seemed to carry all the weight of her lonely rebellion. He tasted the faint sweetness of tea and the sharper, more intoxicating flavour of her own unique essence. It was a kiss that promised not conquest, but sanctuary. A promise of what could be in a world of their own making, far from the gilded cage of Great Jones Street. The city's social season, relentless as the tide, pulled them back into its orbit. The quiet intimacy of the bookshop and the dawnlit park felt a world away, a half-remembered dream. Now the tone was menacing, claustrophobic. The air, once thick with perfume, was now thick with suspicion and the chill of impending ruin. A persistent autumn rain streaked the windows of carriages and grand houses, mirroring the turmoil that was brewing. The epicentre of their undoing was a masquerade ball, a lavish affair hosted by a family whose new money was still in need of the polish of old associations. The masks, meant to be a playful conceit, instead provided a false sense of security, a shield for clandestine behaviour and whispered malice. Julian felt the familiar pressure settle on him as he entered the glittering ballroom, his carefully constructed ambition reasserting its claim. He had made progress. Influential men now sought his opinion, their daughters his attention. The prize was so close he could taste it. Eleanor was there, a silver mask concealing her features, but he would have known her anywhere by the proud set of her shoulders. She looked like a goddess of the hunt, Artemis trapped amongst mortals. Throughout the evening he was aware of her, a magnetic pole he tried and failed to ignore. He was also aware of another man, a powerful and persistent suitor named Alistair Finch, whose advances she had consistently and publicly rejected. Finch was a man of immense wealth and brutish charm, unaccustomed to being denied. Julian saw Finch corner her in a secluded alcove, partially hidden by a large potted fern. He saw the aggressive set of Finch's body, the way he loomed over her. Julian's instinct screamed at him to intervene, but he was trapped in a conversation with a senior law partner, a man whose patronage was crucial to his ascent. He told himself Eleanor could handle it. She was the Duchess, after all. He was wrong. In the shadows of the alcove, Finch, emboldened by wine and the anonymity of his mask, forcefully kissed her. It was an act of possession, a punishment for her defiance. Eleanor shoved him away, her body rigid with fury, her mask askew, but the damage was done. A rival of Eleanor's, a woman of saccharine sweetness and venomous envy, had seen it all. With a quiet, triumphant smile, she slipped away to ensure the moment was witnessed by the most influential gossips in the room. The story twisted as it travelled, gaining a life of its own. By the time it reached Julian, whispered behind a silk fan, Eleanor was no longer the victim but the perpetrator, a wanton woman of loose morals caught in a common tryst. "They call her the Duchess," one woman tittered, "but it seems her blood is not so blue. Caught like a common strumpet." Julian felt the blood drain from his face. He looked across the room and saw the aftermath. He saw Eleanor standing alone, her mask now fully removed, her face pale and distressed. He saw Finch, preening amongst his friends. And worst of all, he saw his patrons, the architects of his future, watching him. Their expressions were cold, questioning. They were watching to see which side he would choose, the tarnished debutante or the world of power and acceptance she had so often scorned. His ambition, that ravenous beast he had fed for so long, reared its head and roared. His heart screamed for him to go to her, to stand by her side, to be the man he was in the quiet of her sitting room. But his mind, the sharp, strategic mind that had brought him this far, saw only the ruin. He saw the doors of influence slamming shut, the partnerships dissolving, the years of striving turning to dust. In a moment of devastating, soul-crushing self-preservation, he turned away. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head to his patron, a silent disavowal. Then he walked in the opposite direction, leaving Eleanor to face the whispers alone. The fallout was swift and brutal. Eleanor was ostracised. Invitations ceased. Carriages that once stopped at the Pembroke residence now hurried past. Her family, mortified and uncomprehending, retreated into a state of shocked seclusion. Julian, meanwhile, got everything he thought he wanted. He was praised for his sound judgment. He was invited to intimate dinners, to brandy-fueled backroom meetings where the real business of the city was conducted. He had won, but the victory felt like ashes in his mouth. The conversations were meaningless, the champagne tasted of bile, every laugh felt like a betrayal. The silence from Eleanor was a deafening roar that filled every moment of his hollow triumph. He would stand at his window late at night, the relentless rain weeping against the glass, and see her face in the reflection. He saw her distress, her shock, her ultimate devastating realization that he, the man who'd promised her a clear air to breathe, had been the one to suffocate her. "I sold my soul for a glass of champagne and a well-placed smile," he thought, the words a bitter litany in his mind, and the cost was her. The days that followed were a blur of hollow victories for Julian. He moved through the gilded world he had so desperately sought, a ghost at a feast. The weight of his cowardice was a physical thing, a stone in his gut. He was tormented by the memory of Eleanor's face in that moment of abandonment, the flash of disbelief, the chilling heartbreak in her eyes before her mask of icy indifference slammed back into place. The turning point came not in a grand ballroom, but in the smoky, leather-bound confines of his gentleman's club. He overheard Alistair Finch holding court by the fireplace, boasting of his conquest. Finch spoke of Eleanor with a casual proprietary cruelty, painting a lurid picture of a willing, even eager participant. He was stealing not only her reputation, but the truth of their connection, twisting it into something ugly and cheap. A white-hot rage, pure and cleansing, burned through Julian. It incinerated the carefully constructed walls of his ambition, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth. He loved her. He loved her intelligence, her fire, her infuriating defiance, and he had sacrificed her for the approval of men he despised. In that moment, reputation be damned. His soul was not worth the price of their acceptance. He strode across the room, his movements so abrupt that conversations faltered. He stopped before Finch, his voice low and shaking with suppressed fury. "You're a liar, Finch, and a coward." The room fell silent. Finch, stunned, sputtered a denial. "Ashcroft, you're drunk." "I am painfully seared," Julian said, his voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the haze of cigar smoke. "You will retract your slanderous statements about Miss Pembroke. You will apologise to her, and you will do it publicly, or I will see you ruined. I will use every ounce of legal knowledge I possess to dismantle your family's business, brick by rotten brick. Do you understand me?" It was social suicide. He was denouncing a powerful man, defending a fallen woman, and in doing so severing every connection he had so carefully cultivated. He felt the cold, judgmental eyes of his former patrons on him, but for the first time in months he felt clean. It was a rebirth. He left the club without a backward glance and stepped out into the night. A torrential rain was falling, a storm that mirrored the tempest in his soul. He didn't hail a carriage. He walked, letting the cold, driving rain soak him to the bone as if it could wash away the stain of his betrayal. He walked all the way to Great Jones Street, to the grand, silent Pembroke house. He had no idea if she would see him, if she would even open the door. He was prepared to stand on her doorstep all night, to beg, to lay his broken pride at her feet. He raised his hand and knocked. The sound was swallowed by the storm. He knocked again, harder. After a lifetime of waiting, the door opened a crack. A servant peered out, then, recognizing him, tried to shut it. "Please," Julian said, his voice raw. "Tell her I am here. Tell her I will not leave." He waited, rain dripping from his hair, his heart pounding against his ribs. Then the door swung open. Eleanor stood there, wrapped in a simple woolen shawl, her face pale and impassive in the dim light of the hall. She looked at his drenched, pathetic form, and for a moment he saw a flicker of the old fire in her eyes. "You have a great deal of nerve, Mr. Ashcroft," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I know," he croaked. "Let me in, Eleanor, please." She hesitated, then stepped back, allowing him to enter. He dripped onto the marble floor of the grand foyer, a place he had once entered with such calculated confidence. She led him not to one of the formal receiving rooms, but to her sitting room, the sanctuary of books he had once breached with a gift of poetry. A small fire flickered in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with weeks of pain and longing. "What do you want?" she asked, her arms crossed, her body a fortress. "Forgiveness," he said, his voice breaking, "though I don't deserve it." And then the storm broke. The argument that erupted was a hurricane of accusations and confessions, of fury and betrayal. She threw his cowardice in his face, her voice rising with every carefully hoarded ounce of pain. He did not defend himself. He absorbed every word, every verbal blow, accepting it as his penance. "You left me there," she cried, her voice finally cracking, tears streaming down her face. "You watched them tear me apart and you walked away." "I know," he said, stepping closer, his own tears mixing with the rain on his face. "And I have been in hell every moment since, a hell of my own making. I chose the cage, Eleanor. I chose the cage over you, and it was the most damnable mistake of my life." His confession, his utter brokenness seemed to drain the anger from her, leaving a vacuum of raw, aching need in its place. The fury and pain had burned away all the artifice, all the masks, leaving only the two of them stripped bare and shivering in the ruins. He reached for her. His hands not gentle at first, but desperate, framing her face, his thumbs wiping at her tears. He looked at her as if memorizing every line, every freckle, as if he could erase the memory of his absence with the intensity of his gaze. The scent of rain on his coat mingled with the scent of her skin, a perfume of storm and sorrow. His mouth crashed down on hers. It was a bruising, desperate kiss, a clash of teeth and tongues, a battle for absolution. It was not a kiss of reverence. It was a kiss of raw, agonizing need. She resisted for a moment, her hands pushing against his chest, and then, with a sob, she surrendered, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. This was not a reunion. It was a claiming. His hands moved over her, frantic, tracing the lines of her neck, her shoulders, the curve of her back. He was relearning the geography of her, a land he had willingly abandoned and now desperately sought to reclaim. Clothes were not so much removed as torn away, a frantic shedding of propriety and pain and lonely nights. The buttons of her dress gave way under his fumbling fingers, his mouth leaving a trail of fire down her throat. He lifted her, her legs wrapping around his waist, and pressed her against the cold, solid wall. Her gasp turned into a moan as he moved with her, a powerful, deliberate act of reclaiming their lost ground. There was no gentleness in it. Not yet. It was a staking of a claim on a future he had almost thrown away. Their bodies found a desperate, perfect rhythm, part apology, part worship. Every shared breath, every movement that brought them closer, was a wordless promise that settled deep within her soul. "I am here. I will not leave you again." Her body arched to meet his, her nails digging into the slick, tense muscles of his back, scoring the skin in a desperate attempt to pull him into deeper connection. The flickering firelight danced over their slick skin, casting them as pagan figures in some ancient rite of atonement and desire. Her release was a shattering cry that was both pleasure and catharsis, a sound that broke the last of his restraint. He followed her into the abyss, his own release a groan of utter, abject surrender. They slid down the wall to the floor, their bodies slick with sweat and rain and tears, their ragged breaths the only sound in the room besides the crackling fire and the dying storm outside. He held her, his heart pounding against hers, the taste of salt from her tears and her skin on his lips. He was home. The gilded cage of Great Jones Street was left behind, a relic of a life they no longer wanted. Julian, having committed social seppuku, found himself liberated. The prestigious connections vanished, but so did the crushing weight of expectation. He rented a small, unassuming office and began taking on cases for those without power or influence, immigrants, labourers, wronged women. He discovered a purpose deeper and more satisfying than the shallow pursuit of status. He found his power not in position, but in principle. Eleanor, free from the suffocating role of the Duchess, bloomed. She shed the last vestiges of her family's disapproval like a heavy cloak and revelled in her new life. She began to write, publishing essays under a male pseudonym that were praised for their sharp wit and radical insight. They rented a small but charming house in a less fashionable but welcoming neighbourhood, a place with a small garden and windows that let in the morning light. They were a team, partners in a life of their own design. Their new reality was built not on social standing, but on shared truths and quiet moments. One evening they hosted a small gathering. The guests were not the city's elite, but a motley collection of artists, writers, thinkers, and a few of Julian's grateful clients. The air buzzed not with gossip, but with passionate debate and easy laughter. It was a quiet declaration of their new values, a society of their own making. One morning they rose before dawn and walked as the city began to wake around them. The air was cool and crisp, tasting of possibility. They stopped on a small bridge overlooking the river, the rising sun painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. Julian took Eleanor's hand. He didn't kneel. He didn't make a grand declaration. He simply looked into her eyes, the stormy sea of them now calm and clear, and slid a simple, unadorned silver ring onto her finger. "This is not a claim," he said, his voice soft but sure. "It is a promise, a symbol of our partnership, of an equal union." She looked at the ring, then back at him, her smile more radiant than any jewel she had ever worn. "I know," she whispered, and kissed him, a sweet, lingering kiss that tasted of the morning and of home. They returned to their sun-drenched bedroom, the light pouring in through the open window, carrying the scent of coffee from the kitchen and the clean linens on their bed. Their lovemaking that morning was not the desperate, stormy passion of their reunion, but something else entirely, a profound, confident intimacy. It was the lovemaking of two people who had seen each other at their absolute worst, and had chosen each other completely, not in spite of their flaws, but because of them. It was imbued with a sense of safety, tenderness, and playful rediscovery. He undressed her slowly, his touch reverent, his gaze full of a love so deep it was almost painful to behold. His hands, which had once been desperate and claiming, were now slow and curious, worshipful. He kissed the curve of her shoulder, the hollow of her throat, the sensitive skin of her inner wrist where her pulse beat a frantic rhythm against his lips. "You're so beautiful," he murmured against her skin, the words a prayer. She, in turn, explored him with a new confidence, her hands tracing the hard planes of his chest, her soft kisses lingering in gratitude. There was no urgency, only a deep, abiding pleasure in the connection itself, a silent conversation of touch and breath. He laid her back against the pillows, the sunlight warming her skin. He began a new exploration, a slow, deliberate journey mapped by his mouth. He traced the line of her collarbone, the gentle slope of her stomach, his breath a warm caress that left a trail of fire in its wake. A shuddering sigh escaped her as his lips followed the curve of her hip, his touch both a question and a promise. Her hands, which had been stroking his hair, now clutched it, her knuckles white. The world began to dissolve. The scent of coffee, the warmth of the sun, the sound of the waking city, it all faded, narrowing to a single perfect point of contact where his mouth met her skin. He moved lower still, to the heart of her, to the very centre of her warmth. And then she was lost. It was a sensory overload that stole her breath and scattered her thoughts. A deep humming current started low in her body, a silent song only he could compose. He worshipped her with a reverence that unmade her, patiently, devotedly, until the slow-building heat became an exquisite torment. Her back arched from the sheets, her head thrown back in a silent, desperate plea. Time ceased to exist. There was only the dizzying, spiralling pleasure he was coaxing from her, a wave of sensation that built and built until she thought she would shatter. When the peak finally came, it was not a cry, but a single, silent, shimmering tremor that shook her to her very soul. It was a wave of pure light and heat that crested and washed through her, leaving her boneless, breathless, and utterly, completely his. He moved up to capture her mouth in a slow, deep kiss, and she could taste herself on his lips, the intimate flavour of their shared devotion. It was the taste of her complete surrender and his absolute adoration, a seal on a promise made and kept. He held her face gently between his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks as if she were the most fragile, precious thing in the world. When they parted for a breath, their eyes met, and in his gaze she saw the entirety of their journey, the ballroom, the bookshop, the storm, the ruin, and now this sunlit peace. With a gentleness that made her want to weep with gratitude, he shifted, his body covering hers like a warm, welcome blanket. For a long moment he simply held her, their hearts beating in a steady, calming rhythm against each other. There was no urgency, only the profound rightness of being exactly where they belonged. It was not a taking, but a coming home. When their bodies finally joined, it was with a sigh of pure contentment from her, a sense of a lock turning, of a final missing piece of her soul clicking perfectly into place. He moved with her in a slow, languid dance, a timeless and unhurried rhythm that was about rediscovery, not release. His hands never stilled. They were a constant, adoring presence on her skin, stroking her hair from her brow, tracing the curve of her waist, his fingers linking with hers. She arched into him, a silent invitation to explore this new, peaceful country they had found together. The quiet tide of pleasure began to rise in them both, a warmth that started in their joined bodies and spread to the tips of their fingers and toes. It was a slow, shared ascent, climbing together, their gazes locked, their breaths mingling. The pleasure was not a sharp, frantic thing, but a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through every part of them, a chord of perfect harmony. Their shared climax was not a shattering cry, but a soft, exhalant pulse, a quiet tremor that passed from his body to hers and back again, a peaceful and absolute completion that bound them in its gentle, shimmering afterglow. They lay tangled in the sheets for a long time after, the sun on their skin, the sound of the city a distant hum. Soon her breathless sighs gave way to soft, easy laughter, a sound of resilient, hard-won joy that filled the small sunlit room, and so they built their kingdom, not of marble and gold on a fashionable street, but of quiet moments and shared truths, a love that was not a prize to be won, but a harbour to be reached, together. Letters from Miss Benson. Of all the prisons a person might inhabit, the most finely appointed are often the most difficult to escape. For Mrs. Eleanor Benson, the grand London townhouse of the Ashworth family was such a place. It was a cage of damask and polished mahogany, of hushed corridors and the stifling scent of wilting condolence bouquets. Grief, she had learned in the 6 months since her husband's passing, was a public spectacle, and she the star performer. She had sought refuge here at the home of her late husband's cousin, but found only a different stage, one with a more intimate and therefore more discerning audience. The Ashworths were kind in that particular way of the well-mannered wealthy. Their sympathy was a heavy blanket she was expected to wear, no matter how it smothered her. Mrs. Ashworth, a woman whose life was a series of managed expectations, spoke in placid, soothing tones. Mr. Ashworth offered solemn nods and inquiries about her comfort. It was all perfectly correct and perfectly suffocating. Eleanor, at 28, felt herself a curious artifact. A widow. The word itself was an ending, a closing of a book. Her own spirit, which she remembered as a bright and restless thing, felt distant, a memory from someone else's life. She moved through the drawing room, a graceful ghost in mourning black, accepting tea and platitudes, her smile a carefully constructed artifice. Another drawing room, another set of sympathetic yet curious faces, she thought. her fingers tightening around her teacup. Will I ever find a corner of the world where I can simply be? It was during one of these ritual afternoon teas that she first truly saw him. Thomas Ashworth, the family's only son, had been a peripheral figure for the first week of her stay, a rustle of paper from the library, a brief formal nod at dinner. Home from his studies at Cambridge for the summer, he seemed to exist in a different orbit from the rest of his family, one governed by the silent pull of books and contemplation. He entered the drawing room that day with the reluctant air of a man summoned from a more interesting world. He was younger than her, perhaps by 5 or 6 years, with a scholar's slight stoop and hair the colour of dark honey that fell across his brow as if he'd just run a hand through it in thought. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a deep, serious grey, and when they met hers for a fleeting moment, she saw not the pity she had grown so weary of, but a quiet, assessing intelligence, a flicker of something that looked like understanding. "Mrs. Benson," he said, his voice softer than she'd expected. "I trust you are finding your stay tolerable." It was an odd choice of word, not comfortable, not pleasant, but tolerable. It was the most honest sentiment anyone had offered her since her arrival. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "It is, thank you, Mr. Ashworth. Your family has been most gracious." Their conversation was brief, a polite exchange about the weather and the merits of a new exhibition, yet it was imbued with an unspoken quality. He did not treat her like a fragile object, but like a mind. When his mother called him away to speak with another guest, he gave Eleanor a small, almost imperceptible bow, his gaze lingering for a second longer than necessary. Later that evening, seeking escape from the well-meaning but draining society of the drawing room, Eleanor found her sanctuary, the Ashworth Library. It was a room that felt sacred, a cathedral of the written word. 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves were packed with leather-bound volumes, their gilded spines gleaming in the soft gaslight. A large fireplace stood cold and silent, and the air was thick with the holy scent of leather, paper, and time. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with a slow, sonorous rhythm, a heartbeat for the quiet house. Here she could breathe. Here she was not Mrs. Benson, the widow, but simply Eleanor, a reader. She ran her fingers along the spines, a familiar comfort. On a reading table near the window, a volume of Keats lay open. Drawn to it, she saw that the margins were filled with faint pencil markings, a delicate, scholarly script. It was Thomas's. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. As loveliness increases, it will never pass into nothingness. Beside the line he had written, "But does it? Or does memory make it so? The beauty is not in the thing itself, but in our capacity to hold it, a fragile vessel." Eleanor's breath caught. It was a thought she had entertained herself in the lonely hours of the night, watching the ghost of her own happiness flicker and fade. His notes were not mere academic observations, they were conversations with the poet, with the ideas themselves. She read on, tracing the path of his mind through the odes and sonnets. He was thoughtful, sensitive, and possessed a touch of melancholy that resonated with her own. In his silent written world he was more present, more real, than he'd been in the drawing room. A feeling of connection, sharp and unexpected, pierced through the fog of her grief. Here was a mind that echoed her own solitude. Before she could reason herself out of it, a daring impulse seized her. She scanned the shelves until she found a collection of essays by Emerson, a favourite of hers. She opened it to a passage on friendship and the solace of intellectual companionship. Taking a small folded piece of notepaper from a pocket she had sewn into her dress for just such private thoughts, she wrote a single line, a quote from a poem she knew well. She did not sign her name. She simply wrote, "In the quiet of these pages, a silent conversation may begin." She tucked the note inside, leaving the book on the table beside his Keats. As a bookmark, she placed within the pages a single pressed pansy, she had kept from a bouquet, its velvet face a deep, thoughtful purple. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, unfamiliar rhythm. It was a reckless, foolish gesture. But as she slipped out of the library, the grand clock chiming the hour, she felt the first flicker of her own spirit returning, drawn out by the promise of a conversation with a man she had only just met, yet felt she somehow already knew. 2 days passed in a state of quiet agitation for Eleanor. She moved through the prescribed rituals of the Ashworth household, but her mind was elsewhere, circling back to the library, to the book, to the note. She both craved and dreaded its discovery. Had he found it? Had he dismissed it as a parlour-maid's fancy? The uncertainty was a low, humming current beneath the placid surface of her days. On the third morning she entered the library, her heart aflutter. The volume of Emerson was no longer on the reading table. A pang of disappointment, keen and sharp, struck her. It was foolish, she chided herself. A game for a younger, freer woman. As she turned to leave, her eyes fell upon a different book, placed deliberately in the centre of the table. A copy of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese. It was not a book she had seen there before. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Tucked within the pages, just beside Sonnet 43, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways," was a piece of creamy, thick note paper folded neatly. His script was as she remembered it from the margins, precise and elegant. "A conversation requires a response. I did not know these quiet pages could hold such a resonant echo. You speak of solace, but you have offered a spark. I confess I have spent 2 days rereading Keats and found him lacking. He speaks of beauty, but not of the surprise of finding it where one least expects it." He had signed it simply, T.A. A warmth spread through Eleanor's chest, a slow blooming heat that had nothing to do with the summer sun slanting through the tall windows. He had understood. He had not only understood, he had answered. That day, a clandestine correspondence was born. It became their secret ritual, a hidden current of life running beneath the stately, predictable flow of the Ashworth home. They never spoke of it, not directly. They never acknowledged the letters, but their existence coloured every interaction. The library became their post office. She would leave a volume of George Eliot for him, with a note tucked inside discussing the moral complexities of Dorothea Brooke, and find in return a slim volume of philosophical treatises with a letter that confessed his own anxieties about his scholarly future, a future his father saw as a respectable but ultimately fruitless pursuit. "I find myself writing for an audience of one," Thomas wrote in one letter, hidden within a dusty history of the Roman Empire. "Your thoughts are the echo to my own, but an echo that clarifies the original sound. My father wishes me to pursue law, to be a man of consequence. But what consequence is there in a life unexamined? You, I think, understand that." Eleanor, her hands pressed against the cool paper, felt a profound sense of being seen. Her late husband, a good man in many ways, had loved her as one loves a beautiful possession. He had never sought to know the landscape of her mind. With Thomas, she felt as though he were exploring it alongside her, with gentle curiosity and profound respect. She responded with a vulnerability that startled her, hiding her letter in a book of botanical drawings. "You speak of books, but you have opened a page in my own heart I thought was closed forever. I too knew a life of prescribed consequence. A wife's duty is to be a mirror, reflecting her husband's world. I am only now discovering that the mirror has a life of its own behind the glass." This written intimacy began to bleed into the fabric of their days. Their glances across the dinner table became freighted with shared secrets. A simple question from him about a book she was reading would feel like a continuation of their silent conversation. He began leaving small, tangible tokens with his letters. A perfect world seashell, still smelling faintly of salt and sea. A sprig of lavender from the garden. and once a rare wildflower, its petals the colour of a twilight sky, pressed between the pages of his note. It was a key, each gift unlocking a little more of the chamber of her heart. One evening, they found themselves alone in the garden. The sun had set, leaving the sky bruised with purple and rose. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine, a sweet, intoxicating perfume. They spoke of trivial things, the coolness of the evening, the beauty of the roses climbing the old brick wall, but their proximity was electric. "The garden seems to thrive under your attention, Mrs. Benson," Thomas said softly, his gaze on a white rose she had been tending. "Things need care to bloom, I suppose," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. She was acutely aware of the space between them, a space that felt both vast and easily conquerable. He took a half step closer, and the world seemed to shrink to the scent of jasmine and the sound of his breathing. From the house, Mrs. Ashworth's voice called her son's name. The moment shattered. Thomas stiffened, a flicker of frustration crossing his features before being smoothed away into his usual reserved expression. "Your mother calls," Eleanor said, her voice regaining its composure. He nodded, but his eyes held hers. "Until our next conversation," he murmured. The words meant only for her. As he walked back toward the house, Eleanor remained by the roses, her hand touching a velvety petal. She had seen her own effect on him, and it was a heady, terrifying thing. Mrs. Ashworth's knowing, slightly concerned gaze had not gone unnoticed in recent days. "I believe our Thomas is quite taken with Mrs. Benson," she had remarked to her husband, her tone light as if dismissing a trifle. "It's a summer fancy, I'm sure." But Eleanor knew with a certainty that both thrilled and frightened her, that what was growing between them in the quiet of the library and the twilight of the garden was no mere fancy. It was a fragile, beautiful, and profoundly dangerous thing. The fragile world Eleanor and Thomas had built in the quiet corners of the Ashworth house was not meant for the harsh glare of London society. The blow, when it came, was delivered with the precision of a surgeon's knife, bloodless but deeply wounding. It came from the lips of Mrs. Ashworth's visiting sister, Lady Danbury, a woman whose pronouncements carried the weight of established opinion and whose eyes missed nothing. The occasion was a grand ball, a suffocating crush of silk, perfume, and forced pleasantries. The ballroom was over-warm, the air thick with the scent of wilting gardenias and human proximity. Eleanor felt a prisoner in her formal morning gown, its subtle grey silk a constant reminder of her status. She had been dancing with a dry, elderly baronet when she saw Thomas across the room, his gaze finding hers over the heads of the crowd. A small, secret smile played on her lips before she caught herself. It was then that she overheard it. Lady Danbury, standing near a potted palm, spoke to Mrs. Ashworth in a hushed, carrying whisper that was designed to be heard. "Helen, you must be careful," she said, her fan gesturing subtly toward Eleanor. "Mrs. Benson is a lovely creature, of course, but her position is delicate. To encourage such a close friendship with young Thomas is most unwise. A widow must be doubly careful of her reputation, especially with a young man of good family, and so many years her junior. People will talk." The word struck Eleanor with physical force. It was as if the music had stopped, the glittering chandeliers had dimmed. A widow, her reputation, his future. The phrases echoed in her mind, a cold litany of social truths she had foolishly allowed herself to forget. She saw their connection as the world would see it, a grieving, vulnerable widow preying upon an impressionable young man, a scandal that would tarnish the Ashworth name and more devastatingly ruin Thomas's prospects. A chill seeped into her bones, colder than any winter wind. She excused herself from the baronet and retreated to a less crowded alcove, her hand pressed against the cold marble of the fireplace mantel to steady herself. The beauty of their letters, the purity of their shared understanding, it all felt naive now, a child's game played too close to a cliff's edge. I cannot be the cause of his ruin, she thought, a wave of panic washing over her. This beautiful, fragile thing we have built must be dismantled before it is destroyed by the world. From that night on, she built a wall around her heart, brick by painful brick. She stopped going to the library late at night. She no longer left letters or sought out his books. When a new volume of poetry appeared on the reading table, a single perfect rose pressed within its pages, she forced herself to ignore it. The book lay there for days, a silent, heartbreaking accusation. In person, she became a stranger. She was polite, cool, and distant, her eyes sliding past his as if he were part of the furniture. She filled her days with Mrs. Ashworth, offering to help with correspondence or charity work, creating a constant, impenetrable buffer of activity. Thomas's confusion was a palpable thing. It radiated from him across the dinner table, in the hallways, in the garden she now avoided. She saw the hurt in his eyes, the bewildered questions he could not ask. He tried to corner her once in the morning room, his face etched with pain. "Mrs. Benson, Eleanor," he began, his voice low and urgent. "Have I offended you? Please, you must tell me." "Offended me? Of course not, Mr. Ashworth," she replied, her voice crisp and formal, refusing to meet his gaze. "I have merely been occupied. Widowhood, you see, comes with a great many duties I had neglected." It was a cruel, flimsy excuse, and they both knew it. She turned away before he could see the tears threatening to betray her resolve, leaving him standing alone, adrift in a sea of unspoken words. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt tense and oppressive. The air was thick with what was not being said. Eleanor felt as if she was slowly suffocating. One evening, unable to bear the confines of her room, she slipped down to the library, needing one last look at their shared space. There, in her favourite volume of Emerson, she found it. A final desperate letter. The paper felt heavy in her hand, as if weighted with his sorrow. Have I imagined it all? Was our silent conversation a mere fiction of my own heart? I feel as though a light has been extinguished, and I do not know who put it out, or why. I would have sooner cut out my own tongue than say a word to cause you pain. Tell me, I beg of you, what I have done. If this is to be the end, then at least grant me the mercy of knowing my crime." She sank into a chair, the letter clutched in her hand, and finally let the tears fall. The book in her lap felt like a tombstone marking the grave of their broken communication. Outside, the sky was darkening, the air growing heavy and electric. A low rumble of thunder sounded in the distance. The storm was coming. The storm broke with a theatrical fury, as if the heavens themselves were giving voice to the tempest in Eleanor's soul. Rain lashed against the tall library windows in violent wind-driven sheets, and the rumble of thunder was no longer a distant threat but a house-shaking roar. Each flash of lightning bleached the room of colour, rendering the familiar shelves and furniture stark and spectral for a heartbeat before plunging them back into the deep shadows of the gaslight. Thomas's letter was a hot brand in her hand. Grant me the mercy of knowing my crime. His pain was a mirror to her own, and the sight of it shattered her carefully constructed resolve. She could not let him believe he was at fault. She could not let their story end on a note of such cruel misunderstanding. She had to find him. She had to explain. To end things gently, honourably. To cauterize the wound so it might one day heal. Clutching the letter, she rose and moved through the darkened, silent house, the storm her only companion. She found him where she knew he would be, in the library, standing before the cold fireplace, his silhouette framed by a sudden, brilliant flash of lightning. He looked lost, his shoulders slumped in a way she had never seen. He turned as she entered, and his eyes, when they met hers, were hollowed out with grief. "Eleanor," he breathed, his voice rough. "Thomas," she began, her own voice trembling, I I came to explain." She took a step forward, the letter held out like a peace offering. "It was never you. You did nothing wrong. It is me. It is my situation, the world." Her words faltered. How could she explain the suffocating weight of propriety, the venom in a whispered word, the future she was so desperate to protect for him? There was talk, a warning, about us, about the impropriety of it. I will not be the cause of your ruin. I care for you too much to allow my name, my status as a widow, to tarnish your future." He stared at her, the confusion in his face slowly melting away, replaced by a dawning, incredulous understanding. And then something else. Not relief, not yet, but a fierce, burning light. "Ruin," he said, his voice low and intense. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his presence overwhelming in the charged air. The scent of rain and old books and him filled her senses. "Do you think that is what I fear? Do you think my future is a matter of drawing-room gossip and my mother's social ambitions?" He took her hands, his grip firm, his touch sending a tremor through her entire body. The paper of his letter crumpled between their palms. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that dwarfed the storm outside. "Do you think a whispered word from a bitter tongue could undo what these letters have built between us? The only ruin I face is a life without you in it." He drew her closer, his gaze searching hers, his grey eyes blazing with a certainty that stole her breath. And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of starving need and profound, desperate relief. It was the culmination of every hidden letter, every stolen glance, every unspoken word. It spoke of lonely nights and a longing so deep it had become a physical ache. It was a claiming, a confrontation, a surrender. His mouth moved on hers with an urgency that swept away all her fear, all her careful reasoning, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their connection. A sound, half gasp, half moan, escaped her throat, and she returned his kiss with a fervour that surprised her, her hands tangling in his thick hair, pulling him impossibly closer. The press of his body against hers was a revelation, a solid, living answer to the ghostly ache of her loneliness. This was not a fiction of the heart. This was real, flesh and bone, warmth and breath. His hands moved from her waist to her back, tracing the delicate shape of her spine through the thin silk of her dress, drawing shivers that left her breathless. He broke the kiss only to press his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in ragged sighs. "Don't leave me again," he murmured against her lips. "Don't ever leave me in that sense." "I won't," she breathed, the promise sealed as his mouth found hers once more. He kissed her like he was breathing her in, each brush of his mouth deepening the ache in her chest. When their bodies pressed together, it was fire and fragility all at once, a dance of need and tenderness, where every sigh seemed to carry a lifetime of longing. The storm raged on, a wild symphony for their silent, passionate reckoning, but within the hallowed walls of the library, the only world that existed was the one they held in their arms. The storm passed as dawn approached, leaving the world washed clean and quiet. The library, which had been the theatre of their tumultuous reunion, was now filled with the soft grey light of a new day. The air smelled of rain-soaked earth from the open window and the comforting scent of old paper. They had talked through the night, their voices low and earnest, sitting not in the formal chairs but on the thick rug before the cold hearth, like 2 conspirators who had finally won their war. All the fears Eleanor had harboured, all the obstacles she had seen as insurmountable, seemed to shrink in the face of Thomas's quiet, unwavering resolve. "They will not approve," she had said, tracing the pattern on the rug. "Your family, society. My family loves me, and they will learn to love the woman I love. And as for society," he said, taking her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "It is a construct of whispers and opinions. Our love is a thing of substance, it is real. That is all that matters." He laid out his plan with a simple, unshakable logic. He would return to Cambridge to finish his final term. It was a promise to his father he felt he must keep. But he would not be swayed from his path. He would not pursue law. He would become a scholar, a writer, perhaps. And he would build a life, their life, not on the foundations of wealth and expectation, but on the bedrock of shared intellect and mutual love. "And you?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Can you be brave enough to wait for me?" Eleanor looked at him, at his earnest face illuminated by the dawn, and felt a profound sense of peace settle deep in her soul. The ghost of the grieving widow had vanished, replaced by the woman she was meant to be. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I can be brave." A few weeks later, the day of her departure arrived. The summer was waning, a touch of autumn crispness in the air, mirroring the bittersweet reality of their separation. She was not leaving as she had arrived, a refugee seeking shelter, but as a woman with a secret, hopeful future. Before the carriage was called, they met one last time in the garden. The ground was still damp from the storm, and the world seemed to sparkle in the early morning light. The roses she had tended were in full glorious bloom. He took her in his arms, and their kiss was different now. The desperate hunger of their first embrace had softened into something deeper, more sure. It was a kiss full of the promise of a future, a quiet communion that spoke volumes. He held her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, as if memorizing her features. "This is not an ending," he said softly, his grey eyes full of a tender light, "but the true beginning." He kissed her eyelids, her temples, her lips, each touch a silent vow. She clung to him, breathing in his scent, committing this moment to the part of her heart that would keep it safe until his return. It was a quiet, profound intimacy that needed no words, a physical and emotional pact sealed in the clean morning air. Her farewell to the Ashworths was polite and composed. Mrs. Ashworth expressed her hope that Eleanor had found some measure of peace. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. "I have found more than that," she said, her words holding a truth only she and Thomas understood. As she settled into the carriage, she looked back at the grand house. It was no longer a prison, but simply a place, a chapter in her story, and she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that the next chapter was waiting to be written. Later that day, Thomas went to the library. The room felt empty without her, but a new feeling pervaded the space. Not loss, but anticipation. On the reading table, where their secret correspondence had begun, lay a single volume of Emerson. It was open to the familiar page on friendship, but her note was gone. In its place was a single pressed wildflower, the one he'd given her, with petals the colour of a twilight sky. Beneath it on the page, in her elegant, familiar script, were 3 simple words: "I will wait." And so, a love that had been nurtured in the margins of books and the secrecy of whispered letters finally found the courage to write its own story. Not in ink and paper, but in the hopeful, steady beating of 2 hearts waiting for their own new chapter to begin. Something in her smile. The world was a blizzard of pink. In Ueno Park, the cherry blossoms had reached their zenith, a transient, almost violent explosion of beauty that painted the air itself in soft hues. Petals drifted on the April breeze like perfumed snow settling on the shoulders of laughing families, clinging to the dark fabric of lovers' coats, and dusting the surface of Shinobuzu Pond with a delicate, fleeting film. To Kenji Tanaka, the scene was a masterpiece of composition, a perfect frame. Yet he felt nothing. He moved through the jubilant crowds with the practiced detachment of a seasoned photographer, his Nikon a cool metallic shield against the world's relentless joy. At 32, Kenji was gifted, his eye for light and shadow preternatural, but his heart was a shutter closed tight. A recent bitter breakup had scoured him clean of sentiment, leaving him creatively numb and personally adrift. The city, his lifelong muse, now felt like a stranger. In an attempt to rekindle some flicker of connection, he had begun a personal project he called Anonymous Souls of Tokyo, a series of portraits of strangers, stolen moments of their lives captured on his sensor. It was a kind of penance, an exercise in trying to feel something, anything again. He saw businessmen in sharp suits looking lost, young women with defiance in their eyes, old men whose faces were maps of forgotten streets. He captured them all with technical brilliance and emotional distance. They were subjects, pixels, nothing more. He was composing a visual symphony of loneliness in the heart of one of the world's most crowded cities. Then he saw her. She was standing alone, slightly apart from the throng that gathered beneath the most resplendent of the sakura trees. She was not posing, not angling for a selfie, not performing for an invisible audience. Her attention was wholly directed upwards, at the canopy of pink and white. And on her face was a smile. It was not a wide, performative grin. It was a quiet, private sunrise, a gentle, unself-conscious bliss that seemed to illuminate her from within, curving her lips in a way that spoke of a deep, simple joy. Yet within that luminescence, Kenji perceived a flicker of something else. A story. Perhaps a melancholy one, that made the joy all the more profound for its existence. It was a smile that didn't erase sorrow, but bloomed in spite of it. His photographer's instincts, the only part of him that still felt alive, took over. The world dissolved into a shallow depth of field, the laughing crowds blurring into a soft, impressionistic backdrop. Only she remained sharp, clear, essential. He raised his camera, the long lens bringing her closer, making the moment impossibly intimate. He adjusted the aperture, his fingers moving with a forgotten grace. He was no longer a documentarian. He was a witness. He pressed the shutter. The quiet, mechanical click was an obscene intrusion, a sound that both immortalized the moment and shattered it. As if she had heard the tiny sound across the expanse of the park, her smile faltered. It did not vanish, but it retreated, the light pulling back from her eyes. She sensed the observation, the theft of her private peace. Her gaze dropped from the blossoms, and for a half-second it swept vaguely in his direction. There was no recognition, only the instinct of a person pulling a curtain closed. Before Kenji could even think to lower his camera, to offer an apologetic bow, to try and form a single word, she turned. With a quiet fluidity, she merged with the stream of people flowing toward the station, her dark hair a disappearing comma in a sentence he desperately wanted to finish. He took a step forward, then another, his heart beginning a strange, unfamiliar rhythm in his chest. But she was gone. The crowd, a moment ago a mere backdrop, was now an impenetrable wall. He was left standing with the cooling metal of his camera in his hand, and an image burned not only onto its memory card, but into the very architecture of his mind. Back in the sterile quiet of his apartment, the city lights beginning to prick the darkening sky, he uploaded the day's work. Face after face filled the screen, anonymous, empty. Then hers. The image glowed. The smile was even more potent in stillness, captured in perfect high-resolution detail. It held a universe of feeling. He zoomed in, studying the curve of her lips, the slight crinkle at the corners of her eyes. It was a face that felt both ancient and new, a paradox of quiet contentment and unspoken longing. "Who are you?" he muttered to the silent room, the words tasting strange on his tongue. He had asked this of his city, of his subjects, of himself for months. But this time the question was not rhetorical, it was a plea. He leaned back in his chair, the glow of the screen illuminating his own stark expression. He had captured hundreds of faces for his project, anonymous souls, but this one was different. It didn't feel like he had captured a soul, it felt like one had captured him. He ran a hand through his hair, a knot of frustration and a strange, terrifying hope tightening in his gut. Another face, he thought, the words hollow. Another story I'll never know. But his own internal voice betrayed him, a softer, more honest whisper rising from the depths. But this one feels like a story I was meant to read. The soft pastels of spring bled into the electric, humid vibrancy of a Tokyo summer. The cherry blossoms were a distant memory, replaced by the relentless green of new leaves and the oppressive weight of the air. For Kenji, the changing seasons did little to alter his internal landscape. He was living in a state of suspended animation, a quiet, persistent ache that had a name and a face but no address. His apartment, minimalist space of concrete walls and polished wood floors in Nakamaguro, had become his monastery. By day it was a studio where he worked with a renewed but hollow vigour. By night it was a shrine. The city lights would paint shifting geometric patterns on his walls, but the only light he truly saw was the one emanating from the 27-inch monitor on his desk. On it, always, was the photo of the woman from the park. Unable to shake the image, and with a sense of fatalism he didn't understand, he had posted the photograph on his professional blog a few weeks after taking it. He hadn't used her face for his Anonymous Souls project. It felt too personal, too sacred for that somber collection. He had simply created a new post, uploaded the single image, and, after a long moment of deliberation, typed a caption, "Something in her smile." The internet, in its mysterious and voracious way, took notice. The image struck a chord. It was shared on Twitter, reblogged on Tumblr, posted on Instagram with heartfelt captions about finding joy in small moments. It became a symbol of fleeting beauty, of unposed authenticity in a curated world. News aggregators picked it up. Art blogs wrote short, glowing pieces about the unknown photographer who had captured the Mona Lisa of the Sakura season. The photograph went viral. It was an anonymous sensation, a ghost in the machine that everyone felt they knew. Fueled by a strange mixture of the public's interest and his own deepening fixation, Kenji made a few tentative efforts to find her. He revisited Ueno Park on weekends, his camera hanging uselessly at his side. He would stand by the same tree, now heavy with green leaves, and watch the faces in the crowd. A fool's errand in a city of 13 million. He wandered through different neighborhoods, Shibuya, Shinjuku, Ginza, his eyes scanning, searching, for a smile that he knew he would recognize anywhere. But Tokyo was a vast, indifferent ocean, and he was a man chasing a phantom. His search was always half-hearted, crippled by a paralyzing fear. What would he even say if he found her? "I stole a moment of your life and it made me famous?" The thought made his stomach clench. Professionally, his life transformed. The viral photo acted as the world's most effective business card. Commissions poured in, portraits for magazines, ad campaigns for brands that wanted to capture that same authentic feeling. He was lauded, celebrated, and better paid than he had ever been. Yet the success felt like a cruel joke. Every compliment, every new contract was a stark reminder of the woman he couldn't find, the source of his fortune to whom he could offer no thanks, no apology. The success was a frame, and the picture inside it was missing. He started to see her smile everywhere, in the turn of a stranger's head on the subway, in the soft light hitting a cafe window, in the brief, happy expression of a child. The world had become a gallery of her echoes. His ex-girlfriend, a pragmatic art dealer, had always mocked his sentimental streak. Photography is a business, Kenji, not a religion, she'd said during their final scalding argument. To spite her memory, or perhaps to feed the new tender part of himself that was stirring to life, he started doing something he hadn't done in years. He started reading poetry. He wandered the book-filled alleys of Jimbocho and bought slim volumes of translated verses, Rilke, Neruda, the stark haikus of Basho. He found a strange solace in the words of others who had known this same quiet, consuming longing. The words gave shape to the ache in his chest. One evening, his friend Haruki, a graphic designer with a sharp wit and a kinder heart than he let on, came over with beer and takeout. He found Kenji staring at the glowing screen, the famous photo illuminating his friend's haunted face. Haruki sighed, setting the plastic bags on the low table. "You're famous because of a ghost, man," he said, his voice gentle. "The photo is beautiful, a masterpiece even. But that's all she is now, a picture. Maybe you should just let her be a beautiful memory." Kenji finally looked away from the screen, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of the room. "What if she's not a memory?" he asked, his voice low. "What if she's a question I'm supposed to answer?" Haruki popped the top on a beer and handed it to him. "And what if you find her, and the answer is just, she was having a good day? What then?" Kenji took a long drink, the cold liquid doing nothing to cool the suffocating feeling in his chest. He looked back at the screen, at the blue digital glow of the photograph that had become the sole source of light in his life. He didn't have an answer. All he had was the image, and the unshakable feeling that his life had been irrevocably cleaved into two distinct eras, before the smile and after. Autumn arrived and painted Tokyo in sombre, magnificent hues. The oppressive humidity of summer broke, replaced by a crispness that carried the scent of wood smoke and ginkgo leaves. The city seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, settling into a quieter, more contemplative mood. It was a season that suited Kenji's heart. His obsession had not faded, but it had changed. The frantic, searching quality had mellowed into a kind of gentle melancholy, a companion he had learned to live with. He no longer scoured crowds for her face. Instead, he sought out quiet places, the places where he imagined a person with a smile like hers might find solace. Temple gardens, small art galleries, and most frequently, the backstreet cafes of Jimbocho, the city's book district. One Tuesday evening, the sky opened up, a steady, drumming rain washing the neon glow of the city into long, slick ribbons on the pavement. Kenji found himself in a small, intimate poetry cafe, a place called the Gilded Page. The air inside smelled of old books, brewing hojicha tea and damp wool. It was a haven, a world apart. He was there to listen, to feel something other than the familiar ache of his own longing. He was not searching. He took a small table in the corner, nursing a cup of tea, and let the atmosphere envelop him. A young woman with short dyed blue hair stood at the front reading her work from a crumpled notebook. Her voice was soft but clear, her poems about the transient beauty of cicada shells and the loneliness of vending machine lights. A fleeting stillness, she read, like the pause between raindrops, a moment of grace before the world rushes in again. As the line settled in the quiet room, Kenji heard a soft, almost inaudible sigh from the table next to him. It was a sound of perfect, empathetic understanding. He glanced over, his curiosity piqued, and the world stopped. It was her. He knew it with a certainty that defied logic. She was sitting alone, her profile turned to him as she watched the poet. She was without the radiant smile of the photograph. Her expression was contemplative, almost sad, her brows slightly furrowed in concentration. Her hair was a little shorter, and she wore simple dark-rimmed glasses that she hadn't had on that day in the park. But it was her. The elegant line of her jaw, the delicate shape of her ear, the quiet, centered stillness she possessed even in a room full of people. Seeing her in the flesh, so close, so real, was like being struck by lightning. He froze, his blood that turned to ice in his veins, then to fire. For months he had rehearsed this moment in 1,000 different daydreams. He would be suave, charming, apologetic. He would explain everything. Now, faced with the reality of her presence, he was paralysed by a tidal wave of doubt. The chasm between the ghost on his screen and the living, breathing woman a few feet away was terrifyingly vast. What right did he have to speak to her, to drag her private moment from the past and lay it at her feet? The reading ended. A polite smattering of applause filled the room. People began to shift to chat with their neighbours. She blinked, as if coming out of a trance, and a small wistful smile touched her lips as she gathered her things. She was getting ready to leave. "Now or never," a voice screamed inside him. "Say something, anything, don't let her walk away again." His body moved before his mind could veto it. He stood up, his chair scraping softly against the floor. He walked the few steps to her table, his heart pounding a deafening rhythm against his ribs. "Excuse me," he said. The words came out as barely a whisper, hoarse and uncertain. She looked up, her expression politely questioning. Her eyes, magnified slightly by her glasses, were dark and deep. He swallowed, his throat dry. I know this is going to sound strange, but I'm the photographer who..." He couldn't finish. The words were too crude, too presumptuous. Recognition dawned in her eyes, slow and then sudden. A complex series of emotions flickered across her face. First a shadow of annoyance, then a flash of embarrassment. But they were quickly replaced by something else, a gentle, weary curiosity. She knew exactly who he was. "Oh," she said softly. "The picture." "I'm sorry," he rushed to say, the words tumbling out of him. "I know it was an intrusion. I should have asked. I never meant for it to become what it became." She looked down at her hands, which were resting on a slim volume of poetry on the table. "It's okay," she said, though her voice held a note of reservation. "It was just a very private moment, made very public. It was strange seeing my own face looking back at me from a stranger's phone." They stood in a moment of awkward silence, the hum of the cafe around them. Kenji's mind was a blank. He had found her. Now what? He could feel her preparing to give a polite nod and leave forever. "I like the poem about the cicada shells," he said, grasping for any thread. Her eyes met his again, and a genuine small smile appeared. It was not the smile from the park, but it was just as captivating. "Me too," she said. "It's hard to explain that kind of beauty to people." They talked then, not about the photograph, but about the poetry, about the soothing sound of the rain against the cafe window, about the strange comfort of being anonymous in a city of millions. Her voice was as he had imagined it, soft, measured, thoughtful. When she finally stood to leave, he said, "The station is a few blocks away. It's raining hard. Could I walk you? I have an umbrella." She hesitated for only a second before giving a small nod. "Okay." Outside, the rain was a silver curtain. He opened his large black umbrella, and she stepped under it, the space suddenly intimate and charged. Their shoulders brushed as they walked. He was acutely aware of the warmth of her arm next to his, the scent of her hair, a faint mix of rain and something clean, like soap. They walked in silence, the rhythm of their footsteps and the drumming of the rain on the taut fabric above them the only sounds. It was a shared silence, not an empty one. Under the small dark canopy of the umbrella, they'd created a tiny private world, a moving island of stillness in the glistening, chaotic heart of Tokyo. Few weeks passed. The crispness of late autumn began to sharpen into the distinct chill of impending winter. Their meetings, which had started with the shared umbrella, had become a quiet, steady rhythm in the cadence of their lives. A series of coffees, of walks through parks now carpeted in gold and crimson, of more poetry readings at the gilded page. A fragile bridge was being built between them, plank by careful plank. He learned her name was Akari. He learned she was a librarian at a small university, a custodian of stories. He learned she cared for her aging, widowed father, a life of quiet duty that she spoke of with love and a faint, uncomplaining weariness. He learned that her smile in the park had been a rare, stolen moment of escape, a deep breath taken in the midst of a life that demanded so much of her. He never once asked to photograph her again. He was afraid to turn her back into a subject, to put the lens between them once more. One chilly Saturday, after a long walk, he found the courage to ask her back to his apartment. "I'd like to show you my other work," he said, his voice betraying a nervousness he couldn't hide. The real work, the Anonymous Souls collection. He needed her to see the rest of him, the part that existed before and beyond her famous smile. He needed her to see the man who'd been searching for connection in the faces of strangers long before he found hers. She agreed with a quiet nod. His studio apartment was minimalist and clean, the scent of photographic chemicals and old paper hanging faintly in the air. The walls were lined with large black and white prints, a gallery of his silent conversations with the city. There were no smiling faces here. There were portraits of exhaustion, of defiance, of quiet contemplation, of hidden grief. Each one was rendered with a stark, empathetic honesty. Akari moved through the space with a reverence that soothed his thrumming nerves. She didn't offer effusive praise. Instead, she was silent, her eyes taking in each face, each story told in shadow and silver halide. She saw what he saw. She understood. She stopped before a portrait of an old man sitting on a park bench, his face a roadmap of a long and difficult life. His hands, knotted with arthritis, resting on a worn wooden cane. She reached out, her fingers hovering just over the surface of the print, as if she could feel the texture of his skin, the weight of his years. "You see people," she said, her voice soft with awe. "You don't just look at them, you see what's inside." Her words landed in his chest like a revelation. In that moment, watching her see his work, really see it, he understood the utter foolishness of his long quest. He'd been obsessed with understanding her, with uncovering the story behind her smile as if it were a mystery to be solved. But he didn't need to know her story to be captivated by her. He simply needed to see her, and he had, from the very first moment. The photograph wasn't the beginning of a mystery. It was the answer to a question he hadn't even known he was asking. The confession that had been lodged in his throat for months finally broke free. "That's what I felt that day in the park," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He stood beside her, the gallery of lonely souls bearing witness. "I felt like I could see everything right in that one moment. And it wasn't about fame or a viral photo, it was about feeling something real for the first time in a very long time. That picture, it didn't change my career, it changed me." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. She turned from the photograph to face him, her dark eyes searching his. The space between them was electric, filled with everything that had been left unsaid over coffees and rainy walks. She stepped closer, closing the small distance. She raised a hand, and her touch on his cheek was tentative, a question. It was not the spark of sudden passion, but the slow, inevitable drawing together of two celestial bodies that had been in each other's orbit for months. He didn't move to kiss her. He didn't dare. He simply stood there, letting the warmth of her palm seep into his skin, a feeling of profound homecoming. He responded not with hunger, but with a deep, shuddering sigh of relief, as if a great weight he hadn't known he was carrying had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Then she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. He kissed her, like he was breathing her in after a lifetime of holding his breath. It was a kiss of gratitude, of recognition. Each gentle brush of his mouth against hers seemed to deepen the ache in his chest, transforming it from something painful into a resonant, beautiful longing. His hands, acting of their own accord, came up to trace the delicate line of her back, the movement drawing shivers from her that left them both breathless. When their bodies pressed together, it was fire and fragility all at once, dance of need and tenderness, of silent questions and resounding answers. There was no rush to undress, no fumbling with clothes. This was not about that. It was about the astonishing discovery of being held, of being seen. It was about the profound, soul-deep comfort of finally being home. Later, as the city lights twinkled outside his window like a distant, beautiful chaos, he made her a cup of tea. They sat together on his simple sofa, the shared warmth of the single mug passing between their hands. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. In the quiet of his studio, surrounded by the souls he had tried so hard to understand, he had finally found his own. Winter settled over Tokyo, stripping the trees bare and painting the sky in shades of pearl and grey. It was a season of stillness, of quiet introspection, and its stark beauty mirrored the new landscape of Kenji's heart. His relationship with Akari unfolded with the same quiet, easy rhythm. There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic declarations. Their love was a garden they tended to with gentle hands, its roots growing deeper in the rich soil of shared silence and easy laughter. He photographed her constantly, but these images were different. They were not for his blog or a gallery wall, they were for him alone. He captured her sleeping, the morning light tracing the curve of her cheek. He captured her laughing, her head thrown back, a joy more radiant than the one he'd first seen. He captured her reading in his armchair, lost in a world of words, her glasses perched on her nose. He was no longer capturing a muse on a pedestal, but documenting the exquisite, ordinary miracle of the woman he was getting to know. One afternoon, Akari was at his apartment reading, while he worked at his computer. She looked over and noticed something was different. "You took it down," she said, her voice soft. Kenji swiveled in his chair. "Took what down?" "The photo," she said, gesturing to his screen. "From your blog. The famous one." He had deleted the post the night before. The image of something in her smile no longer lived on the internet. He turned back to her, a gentle smile on his face. "I don't need that memory anymore," he said simply. "I have the reality." In that small act, he was letting go of the past. He was no longer the heartbroken photographer defined by a lucky shot, no longer the man obsessed with a ghost. He was the man who made tea for Akari, who knew the sound of her breathing in the dark, who was building a life not on a fleeting image, but on a foundation of love. A week later, he accompanied her to visit her father. They took the train to a quiet suburb, the city giving way to smaller houses with neat gardens. Her father was a frail but sharp-witted man who spent his days tending to his bonsai trees. He greeted Kenji with a polite, appraising eye, but as he watched his daughter's easy happiness, the way she would glance at Kenji and share a silent, secret smile, the old man's expression softened. It was a simple afternoon of tea and conversation, but the act of being there, of being accepted into the quiet fabric of her life, was a commitment more profound than any spoken vow. Later that day, they walked through a traditional Japanese garden near her father's house. The air was still and cold, their breath pluming in front of them. The maples were bare, their branches stark, beautiful lines drawn against the grey sky. Ponds, still as glass, reflected the quiet heavens. He stopped on a small arched bridge and simply looked at her. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her dark eyes bright. A stray lock of hair had escaped her scarf. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He felt a love for her so immense, so complete, it was a physical presence in his chest. He didn't need to say the words, she saw it in his eyes. She saw it in the way he piled at her. A smile that was all his own, but one that she had taught him how to find again. That night, Back in the warm sanctuary of his apartment, the chill of the winter garden still clinging to their coats, they moved with the quiet, graceful accord of two people who no longer needed words to speak. He helped her out of her heavy wool coat, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck where the cold had kissed her skin. A shiver, not from the cold, traced its way down her spine. The world outside was a monochrome painting of stark branches and a sky the colour of polished steel, but here inside the air was soft and warm, smelling of the genmaicha tea he was already preparing. The ritual was its own form of intimacy. The pouring of hot water, the rising steam, the way their fingers brushed as he passed her, the simple handleless cup. They sat not on the sofa, but on the floor by the low table, the heat from the cups warming their hands. Akari had changed into one of his own white oversized shirts after a bath, the cotton soft against her skin, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. The top few buttons were undone, revealing the elegant column of her throat and the delicate hollow of her collarbone. It was an image of profound domesticity and startling eroticism. She was wearing his life, making it her own. He watched her over the rim of his cup, his photographer's eye now an artist's soul, drinking in the sight of her. The way the soft lamplight caught the curve of her cheek, the gentle way she held the cup in both hands, the fall of her dark, damp hair against the white cotton. She looked up and met his gaze, and in her eyes was a knowing welcome, an invitation that sent a current of heat through him, chasing away the last of the winter chill. He set his cup down. She mirrored the action. Without a word, he reached across the small table and took her hand. He led her to the sleeping area, a space partitioned only by a shoji screen that filtered the city's ambient glow into a soft, milky light. He didn't release her hand until they stood before the simple futon on the floor. There he turned to face her fully. His hands came up not with haste, but with a reverence that made her breath catch. He gently traced the line of her jaw, his thumb stroking her bottom lip. It was a touch that said, "I see you, all of you." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss entirely different from their first. That had been a discovery, a breathless question. This was a statement, a poem. It was slow and deep, a taste of tea and winter air and a longing that had finally found its harbour. His hand slid from her face to the collar of the shirt. With infinite slowness, he undid the next button, and the next, his knuckles brushing the warm skin of her chest. The shirt fell open. He didn't remove it, but let it drape from her shoulders, a frame for the art of her body, bathed in the soft, forgiving light of the paper screen. His gaze was a physical touch, tracing the gentle slope of her shoulders, the soft curve of her stomach. She wore nothing underneath but a pair of simple white tabby socks, a charming, vulnerable detail that made his heart ache with tenderness. He knelt before her, his hands finding her waist, and drew her closer until her body was framed perfectly in his gaze. He rested his cheek against the soft skin of her belly for a moment, his arms encircling her, holding her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. She gasped softly, her fingers tangling in his hair. A silent permission, but he didn't stay there. It was an act of worship that had only just begun. With a reverence that made her tremble, he pressed his lips to her skin, breathing in the unique, intimate scent of her that was clean and warm and wholly Akari. His kiss, a tender, mapping exploration, began a slow descent. He moved lower, past her navel, into the soft territory where her body curved inward. Her breath hitched. His touch moved with the patient focus of an artist, intent on learning every line, every texture, every secret. When his lips finally found the warm, secret heart of her, a sharp, broken gasp escaped her lips. Her fingers, which had been resting gently in his hair, now clutched him, anchoring herself as the world began to tilt on its axis. Her back arched in a silent, involuntary offering. A wave of heat, powerful and profound, washed through her. A pleasure so intense it bordered on pain and undoing. It started from that single devoted point of his worship and radiated through her entire being, making her knees weak, her mind a beautiful empty sky. He held her there, at the very peak of that shattering wave, his name a prayer on her lips, until she was undone completely by the tender, selfless reverence of his love. He rose, his lips tracing a path of fire from her stomach to the hollow of her throat. He kissed the frantic pulse he found there before claiming her mouth again, this time with a rising urgency. The slow, tender conversation was escalating, their bodies beginning to speak a more ancient, fevered language. The shirt slid forgotten to the floor. Skin met skin in the cool air, and the contact was electric, a silent explosion of warmth and need. He laid her down on the futon, following her, covering her body with his own. His hands moved with a gentle, reverent familiarity, rediscovering paths they already knew and charting new, secret territories. He learned the rhythm of her breath, the music of her sighs. There was a playfulness in their touches, a quiet laughter that echoed in the still room as his fingers interlaced with hers as she arched to meet his every caress. It was not the frantic collision of strangers, but the seamless, fluid intertwining of two souls who had finally found their native tongue. Their shared breath fogged the cold window pane, obscuring the distant city lights, creating a sacred, shimmering world that contained only the two of them. Their movements found a rhythm, a dance as slow and sure as the turning of the earth, as urgent and elemental as a rising tide. It was a love that was less about a consuming fire and more about a generative, brilliant heat. The kind of heat that forges, that purifies, that makes two things irrevocably one. In the final breathless moments, the world dissolved into pure sensation, a shared gasp, a tightening of grips, a silent, shattering peak where their souls seemed to leave their bodies and meet in the space between them before settling like soft snow, back into the profound, soul-deep peace of being utterly known. Afterwards, lying tangled together under a thick quilt, Akari traced the line of his jaw with her finger. "What are you thinking about?" she whispered into the darkness. He turned his head, his lips finding her forehead. He thought of the man he used to be, the man who used his camera as a wall, observing life from a safe distance. He thought of the months he had spent searching, chasing a feeling he couldn't name. "I was just thinking," he said, his voice soft with the truth of it. "I spent so long searching for the woman in the photograph, for an explanation for her smile." He paused, pulling her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair. "I was looking for the wrong thing. The person I truly needed to find was the man I became when I finally looked away from the picture and into your eyes." And in the quiet darkness, with the warmth of her body pressed against his, Kenji knew he was finally home. The story wasn't in the single captured moment of a smile, but in all the quiet, unphotographed moments that came after.